What is the connection between what is now known as Halifax and the French quarter of New Orleans? It is a linked history that dates back nearly 260 years, and it is what we will be exploring as we fly over history. It has been called many things over the years: the Great Upheaval, the Great Expulsion, the Great Deportation, and in French, le Grand Dérangement. It is more commonly called today the Expulsion of the Acadians, and it saw the forcible removal of over 10,000 people in a 9-year period to new lands throughout North America and Europe. So what would drive the British Empire to deport thousands of people from what is now Atlantic Canada? We need to go back to the earliest days of European settlement in North America, primarily the Canadian Maritimes. In 1635, French settlers were moved to what is now Annapolis, Nova Scotia. Then it was called Port Royal. Over the years, the settlers had a tumultuous history, including a civil war amongst themselves between those who resided near present-day St. John, New Brunswick, and those at Port Royal. After the Civil War, which lasted for roughly 5 years, the communities fell under a single administration and included settlements in what is now Nova Scotia, Maine, and New Brunswick. In 1654, the British would capture Port Royal and held it for 16 years. For the Acadians in the area, there was little difference in whether it was the British or the French who controlled the area. They were left relatively undisturbed. In 1667, Port Royal would again become part of the French Empire, thanks to the Treaty of Breda, which ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War. It is also notable as that was the treaty which handed control of New Amsterdam, now New York, over to the English. Over the years, the Acadian settlements would be part of the battleground between the two powers, with several battles and sieges. Eventually, during Queen Anne's War, the British would capture Port Royal and all of Acadia in 1710. There were a few attempts by the Acadians and their allies in the Wabanaki Confederacy to recapture Port Royal, but those were unsuccessful. And in 1713, the French officially ceded the colony to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht. Part of the treaty allowed the Acadians to keep their lands, but many were reluctant to sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to the British Empire. There were also concerns the oath would force the Acadians to fight against the French during wartime, and that they would be at risk of attack from their Mi'kmaq allies for acknowledging the British claim to the region. There were also several Acadians who also refused to sign the oath purely because they refused to bend a knee to the British. The Wabanaki Confederacy, including the Mi'kmaq, were closely allied to the Acadians of the region. Over the years, they resisted the British occupation, with the Acadians lending support, including a line of supplies from Louisburg on Cape Breton Island. In 1753, the 7 Years' War started with the French invasion of the Ohio Valley. In this war, the primary British objective in Acadia was to eliminate the resistance that was supplied by the French fort at Louisburg. The elimination of the supply line from Louisburg and a total warfare campaign that targeted Acadian civilians would bring an end to French power in the area. The decision was made in 1755 by the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, Charles Lawrence, and his council to deport the remaining Acadians. After the Battle of Boishébert at the Isthmus of Chignecto that connects Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, the expulsion of the Acadians began. As men, women, and children were rounded up, their livestock was confiscated by the British soldiers, and the homes and communities burned to the ground in an aim to prevent the return of the Acadians. It started at Chignecto, and soon the communities of Grand Pre, Pisiquid, and Annapolis Royal, which Port Royal had been renamed to, had all the Acadians there forcibly removed. The goal of preventing resistance, however, was not achieved. Acadians who escaped and evaded arrest joined with Mi'kmaq allies. There were a number of battles over the following years with varying successes. This included raids on Lunenburg, a battle at Bloody Creek in 1757, and several other raids against British settlers in the area. The guerrilla warfare continued for a number of years. The push to expel the Acadians wasn't limited to Nova Scotia. What is now New Brunswick saw Acadians arrested and sent to Halifax, where they would be relocated. Thousands would be deported from Cape Breton Island and what is now Prince Edward Island. In 1762, the French captured St. John's, Newfoundland. This gave a boost in morale to the Acadians and Mi'kmaq who were resisting the British forces throughout Acadia. Funded and supplied from French forces in Quebec, they put up a staunch resistance, but they were eventually overpowered by the British, and the deportations continued. In what is now Maine, the Mi'kmaq attacked various villages in New England. They were supported by French soldiers from Port Toulouse on Cape Breton Island, and were led by Charles Deschamps de Boishébert et de Raffetot. This included a battle at Fort St. George, now Thomaston, Maine. Ultimately, however, they would be recalled to Quebec, where they fought in the Battle of Quebec in 1759. The waves of the expulsion saw the Acadians sent to a number of different settlements over the years. At first, they were sent to rural communities across the British colonies to the south. The largest number were sent to Massachusetts. Nearly 2,000 people would end up in the part of Massachusetts that was called Maine. At first, they were not allowed to disembark from the ships over the course of the winter, under orders of William Shirley. Eventually, they were taken off the ships and many forced into servitude. Children were taken from their parents and placed in various families throughout the colony. The British plan sent 1,100 Acadians to the colony of Virginia. There, the colony's government refused to resettle the Acadians. They stated with no notice of their arrival, there was nothing that could be done for them. They were then detained at Williamsburg in conditions that saw many die from malnutrition or disease. Finally, they were sent to Britain, where they would remain until the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. The city of Baltimore would become home to roughly 913 refugees in November of 1755. This started a long and storied history of French settlement in the city, where even to this day, French is the fourth most spoken language. Those who were taken to Baltimore would become sailors and longshoremen, and even created their own community, Frenchtown. Over the years, though, the district would eventually disappear. In Connecticut, the Acadian refugees were welcomed by the legislature. 700 Acadians would come to the colony, where every effort was made for them to be resettled under advantageous conditions. Those who couldn't be resettled would be transferred to a new location, again under favorable conditions. It was a different reception in Pennsylvania. The Acadians were accommodated, but not at first. The approximately 500 refugees would have to remain in port on the ships they arrived in, again under less than hospitable conditions, where disease and malnutrition would have a severe impact. Those who put up the most resistance to the deportation would end up in the colonies furthest away from their homes. Around 1,400 Acadians would be sent to the Carolinas and Georgia. There, they were put to work on plantations. For those who ended up in Georgia, though, there was a unique set of circumstances. The governor of the colony provided passports to the Acadians. These passports allowed travel outside of Georgia, and they went to the Carolinas, where the Acadians there also received passports to allow for travel. They were given 2 ships, and they would start a return voyage to the Bay of Fundy. Others would make the return overland. Of those who sailed, less than half of those who started out would reach their former home in Acadia, others dying in shipwrecks or being captured by the British. After 1758, the British no longer deported the Acadian refugees to the 13 colonies, and instead started to send them back to France. A number of the ships sank en route to France, and it is estimated roughly 1,000 died. In all, roughly 3,000 would end up in France, and gathered in the city of Nantes. Many were offered resettlement by Louis XV in the Poitou province, but by 1775, families had abandoned the area. From France, many of the Acadians opted to resettle in places such as French Guiana or the Falkland Islands. Others went to Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. There were even some Acadians who were allowed to return to Acadia itself by the British, starting in 1764, provided they took oaths of allegiance. There, they would be scattered to prevent any resistance, and many would settle in what is now New Brunswick and along the west coast of Nova Scotia. Starting in 1762, many of the Acadians who had been deported to France returned to North America under the influence of Henri Peyroux de la Coudrenier. They left to settle in a Spanish-held colony along the Gulf Coast, Louisiana. Because of the relationship between Spain and France, the Acadians didn't have an issue with taking an oath of loyalty to the Spanish Empire. They settled in areas along the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya Basin. The region would come to be known as Acadiana. The population of Acadians in Louisiana would start to be called the Acadiens, and then over the years it would become Cajun, which is really part of the heart and soul of Louisiana. Over the years, the French Quarter of New Orleans would eventually become home to many of these Acadians, as well as the families of the original French settlers to the region from 1718. After the Haitian Revolution, many of the Acadians who had settled on that island also moved to New Orleans and called the city home. Today, a living monument to the expulsion of the Acadians is at Grand Pré Park in Nova Scotia. In 2003, then Governor General of Canada, Adrian Clarkson, acknowledged the expulsion, but did not apologize for it on behalf of the British Crown. The proclamation also ended one of the longest court cases in British history, dating back to when representatives of the Acadians made their grievances for the forced removal as well as the loss of their property and livestock. Today, July 28th, is marked in Canada as a day of commemoration of the Great Upheaval.